Hi there, my name is Rindy Anderson, and I gave a virtual talk yesterday for the Division of Research's Research and Action series, and I received quite a number of questions in the Q&A that we didn't have time to answer, so I wanted to take just a few moments and answer some of those here. So here's a couple of questions. How do you track the songs from baby birds through adulthood? Are these birds held in captivity? What happens in captivity to the different songs? So yeah, the best way to study song learning, the developmental process of song learning, has typically been with captive hand rearing studies. So we bring the baby birds in very early on, like 4, 5, 6 days of age, and then we can control the acoustic environment that they're exposed to. We know what songs we are playing to them, and so therefore we can track their development and their imitation, their learning quality of those songs. And so, so the process is we play them 20, 30 different songs from their population. We watch them go through the developmental process. And then at the end, when they're adults and they're singing what's called crystallized songs, so that's the form the song will take for the rest of their adult lives, we can match those songs to the tutor models, the songs that we played to them. And because we know what we played to them, we can see how well a job they did at copying those songs and learning those songs. Are these birds on? What happens in captivity to the different songs? So if you bring an adult bird into captivity from the wild, at least for the species that I work with, nothing happens to their songs. We work with what's called closed-ended learners, meaning once song crystallizes at the end of that critical window that I talked about, typically within the first year, year and a half of life, those songs are not going to change at all throughout the bird's life. And so when you bring these adult birds into captivity, they sing their songs as usual. They may sing more or less because they're in captivity, but the structure of the songs typically does not change at all. You stated that birds sing to signal to rivals and to potential mates, right? Those are the two functions of bird song. Are those the only two reasons that birds sing? Do they sing for other reasons? And then a related question, do birds ever sing because they're happy? So yes, so from what we know, from what we understand, by 70 or 80 years worth of research on this question, birds sing to attract mates and stimulate them for reproduction, so a courtship function, and birds sing in order to advertise their ownership of a breeding territory and to intimidate and repel rivals from that space. So that's why birds sing. Now birds who are, for example, duetting species, and species where the male and the female pair, they mate for the season or even for life, and if they duet, if they sing duets together, that can be a pair bonding sort of a self-reinforcing and pair bonding and pair strengthening endeavor. So you might add a third function of song in species that are duetting like that, where males and female, or even in species where males and females both sing, song could be related to that pair bond in strengthening, maintaining, establishing that pair bond. But again, it's still related to mating behavior, right? And so do birds ever sing simply because they're happy? Well, no, and you know, from a scientific perspective, how could we ever know that a bird is happy? So it would be pretty difficult to test that hypothesis, right? If you wanted to test the hypothesis that birds sing because they're happy, you'd have to first demonstrate that birds are happy and they experience something akin to the human emotion of happy, which would be pretty difficult to do. You could rephrase that question to be, do birds ever sing? Is there a self-reinforcing component to singing song during the breeding season? And I think there is some evidence from captive species they've studied that shows that singing, the act of singing, can be self-reinforcing in terms of the neurohormones that regulate you know, contentment and homeostasis. So, you know, it's like serotonin, right? So there have been some arguments that birds sing to self-soothe, or birds sing to because it feels good, essentially, to sing. So but you know, because they're happy, boy, that would be pretty tough to test. If birds only sing to communicate with mates or to ward off other males, then how do they communicate other types of things, such as when there are environmental dangers? Yes, so excellent point. What I didn't get into yesterday much was that bird song and other types of communication, typically what are called calls, are very different things. So bird song is learned. It can be learned only learned in that very critical developmental window. And so it is not genetic for the most part. It is a learned behavior, and only songbirds can learn it. But then there's a whole nother category of vocalizations called calls. These are social calls, food calls, predator calls, all different kinds of calls. Birds have this whole other vocabulary, if you will, of calls that they make that are not learned. These are genetic, these are instinctual behaviors. So a baby bird raised in a lab without any exposure to adults of a species would not learn how to sing, but it would produce calls appropriately, right? So the calls are the things that birds are using all throughout the year also, right? So song is a seasonal thing used during the mating season. Calls are common throughout the year and serve all kinds of different functions, like you say, social behavior, communication between mates, communication among flock mates, warning of approaching predators, the location and the quality of food resources, all of those kinds of things. So very good point that calls are this whole other category of vocalization that we didn't talk about yesterday. And there was one person who was confused that I was suggesting that animal behavior is responsible for the environmental problems, the human-wildlife conflict problems that I was highlighting yesterday. Things like sustainable development and how building of structures, cell towers, and wind farms are killing so many animals that animals are, in some places decimating crops and causing millions of dollars worth of damage to the agricultural industry. So no, I'm not blaming the animals for this. What I'm suggesting is that the study of animal behavior can help us solve these problems. It's not the animals' fault. Humans are developing at an astonishing rate. The animals are getting wrapped up in our development, and there's conflicts. Conflicts arise when we take their land, when we try to exclude them from their resources, right? So my point was simply that rather than just treat animals like a nuisance that should be eradicated, we should use behavior, the scientific study of behavior, to solve these human-wildlife conflicts. So hopefully that clarifies your question. Animal behaviors, how common are whisper calls, right, that I talked about with the Bachman sparrows with other species? Why do some species have a limited repertoire of songs where others have a large one? So it turns out that this phenomenon of whisper songs being an aggressive threat signal is actually pretty common. And it's not just common among songbirds. I think there are now 11 different species where there have been papers published showing that whisper song or a quiet song is the most aggressive threat signal that a bird can give, or one of the most aggressive, right? So this is actually a phenomenon. It's not unique to Bachman sparrows. And I've studied 3 different species that use whisper song or soft song in their aggressive interactions. And beyond birds, other animals do it too. There's some moth species that whisper. There are within small mammals like meerkats, baboons, or all kinds of species where it's been documented that they will shift from using regular amplitude, regular loudness vocalizations to low amplitude vocalizations, both in the context of aggressive interactions, but also in the context of mating, right? So it's actually a phenomenon that animals adjust the volume of their voices, if you will, for all kinds of different reasons. And the eavesdropping reason that I gave yesterday in my talk was just one of the hypotheses about why they might do this. So why do some sparrow species have a limited repertoire while others have a large one? This is a fundamental question in the study of animal communication. Why do some species evolve elaborate and complex vocal repertoires while others don't? And we're making some progress at answering that question, but really it has a lot to do with evolutionary history. Some species go on a trajectory of their vocal repertoire remaining small. That might be because of evolutionary constraints on their brains, on other aspects of their behavior. So some species just remain limited in their vocal repertoire where others expand that. One explanation for complex vocal repertoires is a social hypothesis. So the more complex the social behavior is in a species, the more complex the social interactions among individuals of a population or a group are, the more complex the communication system is going to need to be in order to mediate all those different kinds of interactions. So this is called the social complexity hypothesis. And the other hypothesis that I talked about yesterday in my talk with regard to songbirds specifically is that it might be that this large vocal repertoire is really like something analogous to a peacock's tail. It's an ornament. The more song types you have in your repertoire, the sexier you are to females. And that's all it takes for that complexity to evolve in males. Let's see, so then we have a whole bunch of questions about mockingbirds, not surprisingly, since they're so common here in South Florida and they're so vociferous, right? So why do some birds sing at night, for example, mockingbirds? I think the evidence would suggest that that is a light pollution problem, that mockingbirds, 1,000 years ago were not singing at night, maybe under a full moon, but that the light stimulates them to sing at night. I have a mockingbird that sings at night sitting atop an extremely bright street lamp. I mean, the street lamp is so bright that it looks like it's almost daytime. So I think that's what's going on with that. Are mockingbirds different from other songbirds? I heard that they emulate other species' songs. Another question, why do mockingbirds copy other sounds so readily? So mockingbirds are vocal mimics. They're a category of vocal learners, a category of songbirds, a group of them that are mimics. And there's here again, there's a bunch of hypotheses about why mimicry occurs, why a mimicry has evolved in some songbird species, but not in others. And again, one of the hypotheses is that vocal mimicry allows birds to continue to acquire new and different types of sounds and song elements throughout their lives. And so they sort of gather them up, they collect them. And so, for example, a mockingbird that's 6 years old is going to have a much larger vocal repertoire than a mockingbird that's 2 years old. And that's a signal that that large repertoire, the number of song elements in that repertoire can signal to other individuals that this is a longer lived bird, or that the brain of that mockingbird is capable of learning, memorizing, storing, and retrieving so many more songs, right? So it's sort of like showing off from an evolutionary standpoint, right? If a mockingbird was able to learn, memorize, retrieve, and sing 3,000 song elements, as opposed to another mockingbird who could only utilize 1,200 elements, well, that might signal something about the brain of that mockingbird with the 3,000 elements, right? And again, if females are paying attention to this and are using song as a way of choosing mates, then the male with a huge vocal repertoire is going to be sexier, right? So that's why they do it. They're mimics, and they are what's called open-ended learners. So unlike the sparrows and finches that I study, where once their repertoire is learned, the door closes and they will never change their vocal repertoire with regard to song. Not true for mimics. Mimics can continue to add new sounds to their repertoire for the rest of their lives. The repertoire keeps growing. And they also do have, so part of this other question, do they sing other birds' songs, but do they also have their own? And the answer is yes. So intermixed in with all of the cardinal songs and blue jay sounds and hawk sounds and car alarms and cell phone rings and squeaky doors and all the other sounds that mockingbirds produce, they also have their repertoire of mockingbird-specific vocal elements. Song units that they intersperse within all that copied material, right? So yes, they have their own songs as well. So here's some questions about the sonic net we talked about. If the sonic net keeps birds out of crops, where do they go to feed since their habitat has already been removed by crop planting? So, right, so the idea is, it's a good question. The idea is that there are other places for these birds to feed. They're simply choosing to feed in the crop fields because that's easiest and most convenient for them, right? And so if we make it harder and less convenient for them, they will quickly go find somewhere else to forage, right? So this is the idea. Now, I'm not aware of studies that track the individual flocks of birds when they're excluded from certain areas to see where they end up foraging. There might be some data on that. I don't know that we really know. But the point is that encouraging these birds to forage somewhere else so that they don't cause millions of dollars of damage to our crops is better than shooting them or poisoning them, which is often what happens. So it might seem like the sonic net is cruel or unfair in some ways, but I would argue that it's certainly better than poisoning and shooting, which can happen, which often happens. So anyway, we're trying to come up with sustainable ways to encourage the birds to leave as opposed to doing something really bad to them. If sonic nets can repel birds, is there a reversal process to attract them to the area? So I don't know. So that's a good question. I know that that social attraction using vocalizations like calls and songs have been used in not just in songbirds, but in other studies to try to encourage animals to reoccupy habitat that they have left for various reasons. So one thing we know is that that the areas around freeways and roadways get abandoned often by animals because of the noise. And if those are important flyways or important pass-through ways, and we want the animals to come back and utilize that habitat, or to try to get them to reconnect habitats that were once dissected up by a road but are now joined back together, when we want to get the animals to come back and use that habitat, playbacks of songs and calls and other vocalizations have been used to try to signal, to try to attract the birds back to that area. So that's all I know about that. It's a field that I don't know too much about, but there's probably, if you Google that, there's probably some interesting stories about how we're using sound to attract animals, not just to repel them. So here's another one. When a caged pet bird at home vocalizes when there's no other birds at home, what does that mean? Well, it's hard to know because, again, we can't see into the minds of animals. We don't know what they're thinking or feeling, or if they even are thinking or feeling in ways that are analogous to us. So that's a real black box and hard to know. But, one thing I would just say to you is, don't you ever talk to yourself when you're alone? I know a lot of people that do. So number one, in some ways, like I was speaking about before, singing can be self-reinforcing. I think sometimes animals, including humans, vocalize because it's self-reinforcing. Maybe it's comforting or self-soothing in some way, especially for an animal that's alone. Also, a lot of the calls that parrots or pet birds make at home, they're social calls, they're contact calls. It's essentially a way of communicating, I'm here, anybody else? I'm here, anybody else? Anybody else? I'm here, right? And so a bird, especially a flock bird, a bird like a budgerigar or a zebrafinch, parrots, birds that evolved in colonies of hundreds or thousands of individuals, they are very used to and have evolved to be in large groups of their own kind. And so calling all the time to establish contact with members of their own species is probably sort of an instinctual thing to do. Is it ethically okay to play songs and calls to bring birds around? So boy, that's a very good question. Most scientists and bird watchers, ornithologists, would say no, you really should avoid using playbacks of songs and calls to try to get birds to pop up and respond to you. And the reason is because I talked about a little bit in my talk yesterday, that when you play a song or a call and get a bird to pop up and sing in response or come closer to you, the bird is doing that with a stress response, right? It's actually threatening to that bird, at least if it's a male, to have another male of its kind in its territory. And so while it's very tempting to want to call a bird out so you could see it better or hear its song, what you're doing is really stressing it out. And you're pulling it away from really important activities like grooming and finding food and feeding young and these sorts of behaviors. And we don't want to pull animals away from those behaviors. We want to leave them alone because they have very strict time budgets. They don't have a lot of time to waste, right? So I would say no, and I think most ornithologists and bird watchers would agree that it is not ethical to use songs and calls to look at birds. During the lockdown, I've noticed more birdsong activity in my neighborhood. Is it because I'm at home more and noticing them more, or are birds benefiting from less activity? So I did talk about this in the talk sort of midway through yesterday, and I haven't seen any data to counter this idea. Most ornithologists are arguing that no, it is not that birds are singing more, it is that the world is quieter. And we are able to pick out and notice and appreciate the songs and calls of birds when it's quiet. When it's super noisy, when there's airlines and leaf blowers and cars and traffic on the freeways, that masks the sounds of birds and we just don't hear them as well. So it's not that the birds are singing more, it's that there's less noise. So let's see. And then finally, do mated cardinals or other birds communicate with each other to tell each other about food sources? So yes, I mentioned that earlier. They use calls to do that. Song is very specifically a mating behavior, a courtship behavior, and a defense behavior. But calls do all kinds of things. They're used for all sorts of social functions. And one of them is to communicate about the location and the quality and the amount of food. And then do parent birds use song to communicate with their babies? Another good question. And so there again, the answer is not really. Song is really directed at adult conspecifics, adults of the same species. So again, males are singing to adult females in their population. Males are singing to adult males in their population. The babies are listening though, right? So it's not that the parents are teaching the babies by singing. They're singing, going about their business, using song for what it's used for. The young birds, however, are paying attention to, listening to, memorizing the songs that they're hearing. But young birds and parent birds do use calls to communicate with each other. And in particular, baby birds use a lot of begging calls to solicit food from their parents, and the parents will call back to them. And mated pairs will call to each other, right? Okay, so I hope that answered some, at least most of the questions that you all had. And again, I really, really appreciate that you attended yesterday and gave me a chance to share the research that myself and my students are doing. And I hope to see you all again.